In accordance with Standing Order 43, the time for members' statements has concluded. Questions without notice. The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware that the Assistant Minister to the Deputy Prime Minister, the member for Hinkler, has refused to deny reports that he's considering resigning to protest against the Prime Minister's energy policy? Can the Prime Minister assure the House that no other members of his executive are considering resigning to protest against the Prime Minister and his energy policy?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I thank the honourable member for his question, Mr. Speaker, he's raised the matter of energy, and he has the opportunity to stand up for lower electricity prices. He has the opportunity to support the National Energy Guarantee, which will contribute to $550 reduction in the electricity bill of the average family in the national electricity market. So he knows that every single leading industry group, consumer groups, even unions, experts, all of them are supporting the National Energy Guarantee because they know it will reduce energy prices. But, Mr. Speaker, there's a difference. On this side of the House, we want electricity prices to be low, lower than they are today, and they're starting to come down already. We've taken decisive action that has resulted in them coming down already. We've seen reductions in New South Wales, in Queensland, in South Australia, but there's more to be done. However, on the Labor side, we know what they think. They want energy prices to be higher. And of course, that's the natural consequence of a 50% renewables target. But, Mr. Speaker, they're proud of it. The Labor Environment Action Network said just a few days ago, high prices are not a market failure. They're proof of the market working well. Well, Mr. Speaker, that's what Labor wants. And, Mr. Speaker, I'm reminded on the subject of the Labor Environmental Action Network of what Senator Keneally said in her first speech. She said that 15 years ago she and Jenny McAllister started the Labor Environment Action Network.
The Prime Minister resume his seat. The Minister for Energy and the Environment will cease interjecting. The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
Yeah, thanks, Mr. Speaker. On direct relevance, the question is about the member for Hinkler, and the Prime Minister is studiously not referring to him.
The Prime Minister is referring to energy policy that was also part of the question. The Prime Minister
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Senator Keneally went on and she said, Lean, this is the Labor Environment Action Network, successfully campaigned within the party for a 50% renewable energy target. Scott Morrison, she said, once described Lean as an infiltration of radical activists within the Labor Party. The Treasurer, Apte, he confirms that's exactly what he said, and he was right. A solar cell, if you will, said Senator Keneally. And then, turning to her comrade, Senator McAllister, she says, now that we are both here, I guess the infiltration is complete. Well, Mr. Speaker, it'll be complete if Labor could ever get a 50% target and have the sign of high prices, because that, according to Labor, is a proof of the market working well.
The member for Murray.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister update the House on the actions the government is taking to reduce cost of living pressures, including those in my electorate of Murray? And is the Prime Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. Mr. Speaker, everything the government is delivering is designed to drive down the cost of living, whether it's in childcare, in medicines, in energy, so that families and households get the help they need. We are delivering on lower prices. Labor's policies will drive prices up. Now, on energy, as we've just heard, the opposition leader says he supports cheaper energy publicly, and yet the Labor Environment Action Network says price increases are a sign of the market working. And, Mr Speaker, we know that Labor's own 50% renewable energy subsidy will drive prices up. And how can forcing more and more renewables into the market do anything other than force prices up? If renewables are cheaper, as many on the Labor side and many in the industry contend, then there'll be more of them and prices will be lower. As Rod Sims has said again and again, subsidising one technology or another leads the way to higher prices. We have to ensure that the market works, and if it works competitively, you get lower prices. Now, Mr Speaker, it's not just on energy that Labor is fighting Australian families. Our plan for childcare benefits up to 1 million families, with a typical family receiving $13 more support every year per child. Labor opposed those changes, voted against them, despite calling for action and despite the greatest level of support going to families who need it most. And when it comes to affordable medicines, Mr Speaker, Australians know that when a drug is recommended to be listed on the PBS, we'll list it because we can afford to. And that's why we've been able to list one new or amended PBS item every day since October 2013, or more than 1,700 items in total, including the listing this month of Rebekha, a treatment for a form of lymphoma cancer which would otherwise cost patients $134,000 for a year's treatment. Compare that to Labor's record. They had to freeze the listing of some medicines because, according to the former Health Minister, Nicolle Flint, there are financial consequences which Labor failed to manage. And when it comes to tax, we believe Australians should keep more of the money they earn. Labor, on the other hand, voted to increase the tax working Australians pay. Our plan for personal income tax relief means lower and middle-income earners will be better off by up to $530 this year and better off in the future with our elimination for the vast majority of Australians of bracket creep.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The member for Ballarat.
Thank you. And my question is to the Prime Minister. And I refer to the Prime Minister's previous answer on PBS listings. How can the Prime Minister boast about the government's record when in fact this government has delayed recent listings of cancer, epilepsy and other drugs by an average of 8 months, after they've been recommended by the independent experts?
The member for Sydney. The Minister for Health has the call. Minister for Health will resume his seat for a second. The member for McMahon is warned, and has been a number of times this week. Take the hint. The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and let me make it absolutely clear. This government has, does and will list everything which the PBAC recommends. And in fact, she may not have caught up on the 1st of August. That included new medicine for epilepsy. New medicine for epilepsy. When someone approaches the dispatch box and they have not done even the most basic homework, that's an embarrassing
Members
fail.
on my right.
If I were the member for Ballarat, I'd be a little bit embarrassed on this day. Just a little bit embarrassed, because when it comes to epilepsy,
the Minister for Urban Infrastructure
and patients are to benefit already on the PBS. One of those moments where perhaps the Leader of the Opposition might look around and say that was an error. Now, let me also quote something. And this is the very thing to which the Prime Minister referred, Labor's 2011 portfolio budget statements. And I quote, "Given the current fiscal environment, the listing of some medicines would be deferred until fiscal circumstances permit."
Yes.
Until fiscal circumstances permit. Not our words, not a paraphrase, the exact budget position. And what were those medicines? Severe asthma, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, blood clot medicines to treat deep vein thrombosis,
Member for Macarthur.
treatment of endometriosis, treatment of in vitro fertilisation and the treatment of schizophrenia. Of the hundreds of questions an opposition could ask, I cannot think of a less wise, more hypocritical or more foolish question that someone could ask. And when we have listed the very thing that they are talking about, with more to come, trust me on that, without them being aware that on the 1st of August new medicines were listed for precisely the issue of epilepsy, what a poor moment. But let me go further than that. Let me go further, because only yesterday I talked about the new head and neck cancer medicines Opdivo at $50,000, which was listed on the 1st of August, along with epilepsy. The new lymphoma cancer, $134,000 for Rebekha, 1,500 patients who benefited from Neulasta. These are all things which are happening on our watch. Labor is hurting because they know they are Medi-frauds and we are Medi-friends. And they know they were caught out delaying listings, and when it comes to the PBS, we have a record which is about treating patients.
The Minister's time has concluded. The member for Ballarat seeking to table a document.
Yes, Speaker, I'm seeking to table a document which shows all of the drugs that have been delayed for over 8 months from recommendation from the independent feedback.
Is leave granted? Leave's not granted. The member for Mallee.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, the Minister for Infrastructure and Transport. Will the Deputy Prime Minister update the House on how tax relief for hard-working Australians is helping families and small businesses in regional Australia, including in my electorate of Mallee? What are the risks to regional Australia getting ahead?
The Deputy Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Tax cuts for small business, including Mallee, including all over Australia, are good for regional Australia, good for Australia in general. Income tax for hard-working Australians mean that they can have more money in their pockets to spend on themselves, on the things that they want to do in life. More jobs for hard-working Australians, whether it's in the Mallee, wherever it is, means that there are going to be more people gainfully employed. And we saw the employment statistics out today. Unemployment down. We've heard the Prime Minister in question time already stating today that power prices are down, and they're going to go down further. We're making sure that the economy is strong. And when the economy is strong, when the economy is going well, then you can provide more money for hospitals, more money for schools, and that's exactly what we're doing. Now, Mallee is doing it tough at the moment with the drought. Mallee is doing it tough, as is a lot of areas right throughout New South Wales, right throughout the member for Marinoa's electorate, right throughout Queensland. People are doing it tough with the drought. That's why we're providing more money for household assistance, farm household assistance, more money for rural financial counsellors, more money for, indeed, mental health nurses to help out those drought-stricken farmers, to help out drought-stricken communities. And one example of a business which is doing particularly well, despite the troubled times, is Interlink Pumps and Sprays at Mildura. It sells spot sprays, vine sprays, weed sprays and row crop sprays throughout Victoria and southern New South Wales. And I know it sells a lot of these sprays into the Murrumbidgee irrigation area, that great food bowl in the member for Farrer's electorate. And I met with the team in Mildura alongside the member for Mallee recently. Its CEO, Peter McWilliams, who employs 28 people. He said that the money that they'll be saving from the company tax cuts has not only enabled his business to do more in the innovation space, redirecting to further research for spraying technologies to reduce further drifts in the spraying, but indeed it's helped them to put on an extra employee. Now, isn't that fantastic? An extra employee, despite the drought, despite the troubled times. He is taking the confidence from the tax cuts, from the confidence of the economy growing, to put on an extra employee. And throughout the Mallee, we're investing in infrastructure, that economic enabling infrastructure, better roads, better rail, such as the Calder Highway, Bendigo to Mildura upgrade, $10 million. Murray Basin Freight Rail Project, $240 million. Western Highway Stall to South Australia border upgrade, $10 million, investing in the infrastructure that our regions need, that our regions want, that our regions deserve. But we look at those opposite who stand for higher taxes, higher power prices, less infrastructure. And if they get into government, all that will go. All the money that we're spending on infrastructure will go.
Concluded. The member for Wakefield.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Is the Prime Minister aware of media reports that during a briefing on his energy policy, the Prime Minister said to the member for Warringah, "Please do me the courtesy of allowing me to finish my sentence"? The member for Warringah replied, "I would have if you allowed me the courtesy of finishing my term." Was the Prime Minister again speaking merchant banker gobbledygook?
The member for Wakefield will resume his seat. That question is out of order. We'll go to the next question. The member for Mayo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Prime Minister, one of my constituents, an Indigenous man—
Member for Mayo, we'll just pause for a second. Members on my left, you could cease interjecting. I can't hear the member for Mayo. If you could start your question again.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, one of my constituents, an Indigenous man named Mr Henley Vogt, has approached me regarding an issue close to his heart. There are 4 flagpoles in this chamber and none of them carry the Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander flags. We've seen over the last 2 days that language matters and action matters. Yesterday, this House was united to condemn racism and discrimination. In a continuation of that spirit and the spirit of reconciliation and recognition of the history and culture of Australia's First Peoples, will the government support flying the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags in this chamber? Thank you.
The Leader of the House on a point of order.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister is probably more than happy to remark on it. It's not actually within his responsibilities because it's a matter for the standing orders and therefore the House. And with that clarification, the Prime Minister might like to.
No, just before I call anybody. No, I've listened to the question, and it's certainly not the Prime Minister's responsibility, and I'd need to check where the responsibility lies, whether it is the standing orders or yes, the Leader of the Opposition.
I thought the question, and I didn't hear all of it, but I thought the question by the member for Mayo ended on whether or not the government supports such a measure and if it's of assistance to the Prime Minister, as these things should be, as they were yesterday. We'll offer bipartisanship if you choose to take up the member for Mayo's offer.
The member for Mayo, that last part of the question, if you could just repeat that. Thank you.
Certainly. In continuation of that spirit, the spirit of reconciliation and recognition of the history and cultures of Australia's First Peoples, will the government support flying the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags in this chamber?
Prime Minister has.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. I thank the honourable member for a question. I imagine the honourable member will seek to move a motion to amend the standing orders for that purpose. Assuming that is necessary, it is within the Speaker's responsibility, as we understand. But it's we take the honourable member's suggestion on board. But I have to say, Mr. Speaker, and remind the honourable member while we pay great respect to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander flags, the flag hanging in each corner of this room is the flag of Australia.
The member for Robertson. Member for Robertson has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And my question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer please update the House on the release of today's Jobs data? Treasurer, how is the government's economic plans creating more jobs while supporting Australian taxpayers with lower, fairer and simpler taxes so that they can keep more of what they earn?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Robertson for a question, and I'm sure all members of this side of the House, and I hope all members of that side of the House, would be pleased to know that unemployment has fallen to 5.3%. That is the lowest level of unemployment we have seen since November of 2012, almost 6 years. Unemployment falling to 5.3%, 19,300 extra full-time jobs created in July of this year, the month just passed. That's great news. It's also great news that 300,300 jobs have been created in just the last 12 months, 65% of them, almost two-thirds of those jobs, full-time. It's great news that around 600,000 jobs have been created since the last election under the economic policies of the Turnbull government, Mr Speaker. 600,000 jobs, and there are 21,300 Australians less unemployed today than there was at the time of the last election. So fewer people unemployed, almost 600,000 more people in work, Mr Speaker. Unemployment falling to 5.3%. This is good news for the Australian economy. It's good news, Mr Speaker. It's very good news. It's very good news for people out there seeking work. But it goes further than that. More than 1 million jobs have been created by the coalition government since we were first elected in 2013. Since 2013, more than 1 million jobs, as we promised, as has been delivered and as has been exceeded in the time frame that we pledged at that election. Youth unemployment is down to 11.1%, and that is the best result. I hear the Shadow Treasurer question whether this is achievement, Mr Speaker. He questions whether youth unemployment falling to its lowest level since March 2012 is an achievement. Mr Speaker, how could you have a Shadow Treasurer who wants to be Treasurer of this country and thinks Australians getting jobs, young people getting jobs, youth unemployment falling
Member for McMahon.
is not an achievement, Mr Speaker. It's an achievement for those young people. It's an achievement for the businesses who put them into those jobs. Let's not forget it was the Labor Party who opposed the Youth Path program that has put 28,000 young people into jobs, Mr Speaker. This government is a jobs machine working together with the Australian economy that is a jobs machine that is responding to the economic policies. And I'm asked, Mr Speaker, well, what about what's been happening with earnings? Well, I can tell you that the weekly earnings data released today is up 2.7%. That is the strongest result since November of 2014. That full-time ordinary time earnings wage now is $82,700. The gender pay gap has fallen to 14.5%, down from under Labor 17.2%.
The member for Port Adelaide.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. This morning, the former Deputy Prime Minister, the member for New England, said about the Prime Minister's energy policy, and I quote, "I've heard the stories in the past, how it was going to drive down prices, and it didn't. Why should Australians believe promises from this Liberal National Government when even the former Deputy Prime Minister has confirmed the government lied on power bills before?"
The member for Port Adelaide, I just caution him on some of the language in that. I'll happily hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Speaker, just on that point, the phrase with respect to Labor has been used many times in answers, and if there's to be a new ruling, we're fine, not objecting in any way to the new ruling, but would simply want to note that this would not be, as I understand it, a ruling with respect to questions, but a ruling with respect to what was parliamentary.
Yeah, okay. I'm just going to call the Minister, and I thank the Manager of Opposition Business. I said the Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Oh.
Yes, and I can go right through the practice again about how the Prime Minister is entitled to refer the question to any minister. The Minister, Deputy Prime Minister will cease interjecting. The Minister for the Environment has the call.
You're so vain.
You probably think this Parliament's about you.
You can't see what's going on.
Minister has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, the Parliament knows that when the carbon tax was abolished, the Australian Bureau of Statistics confirmed it was the single biggest drop in electricity prices ever recorded. Mr Speaker, that is the fact of the matter. And yesterday, into Hansard, in the MPI debate, I read from an ACCC press release which said that the $550 reduction that was coming from the abolition of the carbon tax and estimated by Treasury was absolutely reasonable, Mr Speaker. But what the member for Port Adelaide fails to tell this House is that when Labor was last in office, electricity prices doubled. They went up each and every year. And the member for Port Adelaide comes from a state where a Labor government completely wrecked the energy system, and South Australia was left with the highest prices in the country, Mr Speaker. And in the member for Port Adelaide's own electorate, companies had lost their power and lost jobs and lost millions of dollars as a result. And what did the member for Port Adelaide call it? He called it a hiccup, Mr Speaker. But, Mr Speaker, as the Prime Minister has made it clear, everything's been revealed by Lean Australia, who said that high prices are not a market failure, they are proof of the market working well. So what do you think the Shadow Minister for Energy thinks about Lean, Mr Speaker? And he says, and I quote, "In my nearly 30 years in the party, I have not seen an organising effort on a policy issue like Lean has delivered. It was phenomenal. It gave Bill and I and the rest of the Shadow Cabinet the assurance that the party was behind us as we stepped out to lead on climate change." So, Mr Speaker, Lean speaks for the Labor Party. Lean directs the Shadow Minister. And, Mr Speaker, just to finish, today there was a very revealing front page in the Australian Financial Review, which made it very clear that higher emissions reduction targets will mean higher prices for Australian consumers. And the Grattan Institute said about Labor's claims that prices would go down as a result of higher emissions reduction targets, that this is unlikely to be sustainable, that it would accelerate plant closures, that it will require higher consumer prices, and that it would be inherently uncertain. Mr Speaker, this is what the Labor Party is promising the Australian people: higher power prices, lower stability, reckless renewable energy targets, recklessly high emission reduction targets, which the business community rejects and the people of Australia reject.
The member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Foreign Affairs. Will the minister update the House on the importance of affordable energy in maintaining Australia's international competitiveness and how Australian energy prices compare to other nations? Is the minister aware of any other suggestions?
The Minister for Foreign Affairs.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Boothby for her question. She is a great advocate for employers and employees in her electorate and has been for many, many years. Mr Speaker, Australia is a global energy superpower.
Member for Wakefield.
We are a leading exporter of coal, of LNG, of uranium. We are a leading researcher into the technologies surrounding solar power, pumped hydro storage and battery power. Yet, under successive state and federal Labor governments, paradoxically, this global energy powerhouse, this superpower, has amongst the highest electricity prices in the world because of Labor policies. Indeed, the ACCC report commissioned by the Treasurer into electricity affordability has shown that South Australia is the third highest electricity price in the world. Across the planet, South Australia had the highest electricity prices. And it's also shown that the average national energy market price is higher than the average of the entire European Union. So these are monumental failures by Labor governments. And the Independent Energy Security Board has warned that high electricity prices will impact on Australia's international competitiveness, that will harm our economic growth, that will harm our jobs growth. That is why the Turnbull government has intervened in the gas supplies to secure them. That is why the Turnbull government has taken on the electricity generators and the retailers, and as a result we are seeing prices coming down. Now, that is why the big businesses in Australia who employ thousands and thousands of Australians back our national energy guarantee, because they know it's a mechanism to bring prices down. In fact, it's estimated that wholesale electricity prices will decrease by 20%. And of course, in addition, we will see the forecast of average household bills coming down by $550. So that poses the question, why does Labor support policies that will harm our international competitiveness, destroy jobs? Because Labor is captive to the Greens, and that is why Labor has an ideological, irresponsible 50% renewable energy target, an irresponsible 45% emissions reduction target. They will harm Australian industries. They will harm jobs. That is why we back a national energy guarantee, because the Turnbull government stands for affordable and reliable power. Labor stands for higher prices, higher costs, less jobs.
The Prime Minister's time has concluded. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that the Energy Security Board modelling reveals—
The Leader of the Opposition will just return to his seat. I just want to verify the— I heard a unparliamentary and unsavoury term. I want to ask the member for Eden Monero whether it was he who uttered it.
Well, if it was, Mr Speaker, I withdraw.
No problem. Members on my right, the Leader of the House. I'm waiting for members to cease interjecting if they're— the Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, one of the hallmarks of this House is a robust debate, but it does not degenerate into that kind of gutter language in the chamber. And the member should do more than withdraw. He should apologise and withdraw.
The Leader of the House makes a fair point. The practice makes it clear that a withdrawal is regarded as an apology, but I think, given the circumstances, it would assist the House if the member for Eden Monero did both.
Well, I apologise, Mr Speaker, and withdraw.
Thank you. And I'm going to call the Leader of the Opposition to begin his question again.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that the Energy Security Board modelling reveals that under the National Energy Guarantee, residential electricity bills increased by $210 between 2024 and 2030, and that wholesale electricity prices actually rise from 2024?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
What is absolutely clear from the Energy Security Board's modelling is that power prices with the National Energy Guarantee will come down by $550, Mr Speaker. That is why the member for Port Adelaide described it as a very good design. That is why he described it as being a Rolls-Royce. That is why the International Energy Agency said this could be a model for other countries around the world. That is why every large miner, manufacturer, farmer from around the country, industry group, has got behind the National Energy Guarantee. And the Leader from the Opposition, he talks a big game. He writes to the Prime Minister last year and says, I want to reach across the political divide. I want to end the climate wars. I want to lower power prices. But when it comes to walking the talk, he goes missing, Mr Speaker. He goes missing. And it's maybe because they don't even know what their own policy is. They don't even know what their own policy is. They went to the last election promising an emissions intensity scheme. That will drive power bills up by $300, Mr Speaker, compared to the National Energy Guarantee. They went to the last election with a 45% emissions reduction target, which the Business Council of Australia, representing 1 million+ workers across the country, described as economy wrecking, Mr Speaker. And they went to the last election with a 50% renewable energy target. But they don't know what their own policy is, because you'd think the Shadow Treasurer, the member for McMahon, would know about their renewable energy target. So he went on Sky with David Spears, and David Spears said, what about the renewable energy target? You have heard Bill Shorten on radio this morning, I'm sure, unable to say what it would cost. Are you able to say what it would cost? Member for McMahon. Well, what we have is two Labor policies. The renewable energy target, then there's the goal of getting to 50% renewable energy. Hang on, says Spears. There's a difference between a goal and a renewable energy target. Well, there's a renewable energy target, and then we have the 50% aspiration, which is separate to our renewable energy target. Hang on, says David Spears. That sounds like an important nuance. Member for McMahon. Well, there's nothing new here, David, nothing new. You asked me about the renewable energy target, and I don't want to mislead you. Again, David Spears, your colleague Mark Butler does refer to it as a 50% renewable energy target. Well, then there's the RET, and I'm being precise with you know, intentionally. Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition, the member for McMahon, the member for Port Adelaide don't even know what their policy is. But what the Australian people know is one thing. Under the Labor Party, you'll always pay more for your power.
The member for Cowper.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Small and Family Business, the Workplace and Deregulation. Would the Minister update the House how small businesses will benefit from the implementation of the government's National Energy Guarantee? Could the Minister also advise on how these businesses may be adversely affected if alternative proposals are implemented?
The Minister for Small Business.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Cowper for his question, acknowledging that he has a regional seat. And in the winter recess, Mr Speaker, I had the opportunity to travel around Australia and visit places like Cairns with the member for Leichhardt, Noosa with the member for Wide Bay, Lismore for the member with Page, Mount Gambier, the member for Barker, Shepparton, the member for Murray. And, Mr Speaker, at all these places it didn't take long when talking to small and family business operators for the conversation to turn to power prices. In fact, in the member for Leichhardt's seat, there was one store owner there that told me that power is now his biggest monthly expense, overtaking his rent for the first time. Mr Speaker, that's why the moves by the Minister for the Environment, the work he's done so far, has already has great results. Wholesale power prices 25% lower this year. In my home state of New South Wales as of the 1st of July. Power decreases both for small and family businesses and residential. But the National Energy Guarantee, Mr Speaker, is the missing piece of the puzzle, the piece that we need to introduce so that small and family businesses Australia-wide will have the opportunity to, as the modelling shows, to enjoy 20% on average of wholesale electricity price decreases in the lead up to 2030. This would allow small and family businesses to have more of their own money kept in their pocket. What happens then, Mr Speaker, and we've seen it today with the latest unemployment figures, we've heard it from the Treasurer and the Prime Minister with the 1 million jobs created by the economy over the last 4.5 years, small and family business owners will reinvest in themselves, back themselves, take on bank debt and employ more people. That's how it happens. But, Mr Speaker, the Minister for the Environment has mentioned already today, it's not just business groups representing businesses irrespective of size that are saying that this is a policy position that should be adopted. It's business, it is all across the board. The AWU, the Leader of the Opposition's own union, from his background, Ben Davis, from the Victorian Secretary, has said in the last 24 hours this must be passed through Parliament. It's not often, Mr Speaker, and I note the interjection on the CFMEU, it's not often that you'll find me standing at this dispatch box agreeing with something that they say. But the National President of the CFMEU, Tony Marr, in the last 48 hours has come out in support of the National Energy Guarantee. Mr Speaker, for the sake of households and small and family businesses across Australia, irrespective of size, it is vital that the Leader of the Opposition, for once in his life, show he's more interested in political outcomes than political gains.
The Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Prime Minister claims that his National Energy Guarantee will lower power prices by $150 by the 2020s, by removing uncertainty. But the Prime Minister's cutting the energy supplement, which will cost a single pensioner $365 a year, a cut which his own backbench, including the member for Dawson, have told him to reverse. Isn't the only certainty for pensioners that they'll always be worse off under this Prime Minister?
The Prime Minister has the call.
The answer is no, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, the Australian government, and this my government, supports pensioners, provides them with the support that they deserve. We are not, as Labor is proposing to do, stealing their savings. Let's not forget the Labor Party, the honourable member's party, wants to go after the savings of pensioners and self-funded retirees. Oh, they do. Well, they do. Well, they do. There used to be a bipartisan agreement that people on low incomes were entitled to get the cash benefit of those franking credits, and that was Labor's policy. Labor took it to an election, in fact, and it was passed through this parliament by Peter Costello with bipartisan support, and now the Labor Party wants to go after it. And who is going to pay? It's going to be the people that will pay, will be self-funded retirees, $5 billion a year. They think they'll be getting, and pensioners, yes, pensioners that come on now will be getting it as well. Oh yes,
members on both
yes,
sides.
You're misleading the House. You're misleading the House. You know, Labor is going after the savings of older Australians in a shameful cash grab, and they should be appalled at the injustice of this assault on older Australian savings.
The member for Canning.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Defence Industry. Will the Minister update the House on how the government's strong management of the economy enables job-creating investment in our defence industry, such as the Henderson shipyard in my state of Western Australia, which employs many workers from Canning? What are the consequences for industry and workers of following a different course of action?
The Minister for Defence Industry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Canning for his question. He's a very proud West Australian and represents a large part of the area where the workers of Henderson, of course, are drawn from. And the very good news, of course, for Perth and Henderson particularly, is that the government's decision to build 9 anti-submarine warfare frigates in Australia at a cost of $35 billion by BAE and ASC Shipbuilding that we announced a few weeks ago will have an enormous impact in Henderson and in Perth generally, because we will build $670 million of new infrastructure to support the Hunter-class frigates. $670 million driving jobs, driving growth, supporting Western Australian businesses because of the frigates. The HMAS Sterling will become the home of the Hunter-class anti-submarine warfare frigates training. Henderson will also become the hub for the maintenance and sustainment of the Hunter-class frigates in the future when they are completed, Mr Speaker. The investment in Sterling and in Henderson includes an extension of existing wharfs, the constructions of maintenance and storage buildings, the construction of new medical facilities and accommodation, and the new Navy Systems Training Centre, all because of the decision of this government to make Henderson the centre for those parts of the anti-submarine warfare frigate project. But this is in addition to other commitments that we've announced and made in Henderson over the last couple of years. $300 million in upgrades to the HMAS Sterling and Henderson because of the offshore patrol vessels being based in Perth, many of them being based in Perth. $150 million in upgrading the wharves and accommodation because of the because of the new supply ships being based as well at Henderson and Sterling. A $367 million commitment to redevelop the HMAS Sterling infrastructure, including power and water upgrades, and that's just the Commonwealth spending. There's also the $70 million new shipbuilding facility that CIVMEC is building to build the offshore patrol vessels. And I hear the member for Eden Monaro say, interject. The reality is, if Labor had stayed in power, none of those 10 offshore patrol vessels would have been built in
Minister
Australia.
for Defence Industry will just pause for a second. The member for Eden-Monaro is lucky to still be in question time. Very lucky to still be in question time. He'll cease interjecting. The minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The 21 Pacific patrol boats would never have been built. They're being built at Henderson. The last ship for the Navy that would have been built in Australia is the HMAS Sydney, the air warfare destroyer. Because of the decision of this government, the Abbott government and now the Turnbull government, Mr Speaker, we're building 54 vessels in this country. The 9 Hunter-class anti-submarine warfare frigates have been the latest, but the submarines, the offshore patrol vessels, the Pacific patrol boats.
The Leader of the Opposition.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Wages growth has never been lower under any other Prime Minister. Australians are struggling with cost of living, with their out-of-pocket health costs going up and up, out-of-pocket childcare costs increasing for at least 1 in 4 Australian families, and of course power bills are up and up. Why under this Prime Minister does everything go up except people's wages?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. On a matter of recent financial information from the Treasury, the average weekly Ordinary Times earnings for full-time adults increased by 1% to $1,585 in the 6 months to May 2018, to be 2.7% higher through the year. This is the highest through-the-year growth rate since November 2014. There is more work to do, more to be done, but we are seeing the results of a stronger economy and more jobs. More demand for labour is creating skill shortages, as the Reserve Bank Governor observed the other day, and we're starting to see wage increases, and they are reflected in the numbers. But I note the Leader of the Opposition has talked about the take-home pay of Australian workers, and we want Australians to keep more of the money they earn. In that case, why is he opposing? Why is he opposing us bringing down electricity prices? Why does he want Australians to pay more for electricity? Why did he oppose lower income taxes for every working Australian? Why is he opposing pay rises for workers by opposing tax relief for Australian businesses? Why did he oppose our new childcare subsidy that gives a typical family $1,300 more support for each child each year? And why, when he was a union leader, did he spend his time trading away penalty rates in order to put workers at a disadvantage in return for support from their employers? Why did he turn a blind eye to the big unions that bankroll the Labor Party while slashing the pay of Australia's lowest paid workers? Why did he deny 7,400 workers a pay rise last year when he chose to play political games and block a government bill that would have ensured those workers received a pay rise? Why, Mr Speaker, did he oppose our multinational tax legislation which cracks down on tax avoidance? Why, Mr Speaker, if he's so concerned about hard-working Australian families, why did he oppose our corrupting benefits legislation which cracks down on secret deals of the kind he used to be very good at between unions and big business? And why is he imposing or seeking to impose over $200 billion in higher taxes on Australian families, targeted at low-income families, including, and perhaps most shamefully of all, those self-funded retirees who will be stripped of up to 30% of their income by this shameless, high-taxing Labor leader, were he ever to be Prime Minister?
The member for Barton will cease interjecting. The member for Bennelong has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Revenue and Financial Services and Minister for Women. Will the Minister update the House on the steps the government is taking to improve women's economic security? Is the Minister aware of any suggestions that might undermine this success?
The Minister for Revenue, Financial Services and Women.
I thank the member for Bennelong for his question and recognise his deep commitment in ensuring that Australian women can have equal opportunity to participate in our economy, and his deep commitment to their economic security. He understands, just like everybody on this side of the chamber, that it is important to give women choices and to give them more options in their life, and you can do that by ensuring that they are more economically secure. Because, of course, on this side of the chamber, we actually believe in aspiration. We believe that it is good to help people to get ahead, and that's why it's so pleasing that I can advise the chamber that today we are having more women employed in record numbers than ever before. And of the more than 1 million jobs that have been created under this government, the majority of those jobs have gone to women. And it's also important to note that this government has been making an impact when it comes to closing the gender pay gap. When Labor was in office, and they won't talk about this, but when Labor was in office, the gender pay gap was 17.2%. Now, under this government, I'm pleased to report that it is down to 14.5%. 14.5%. Now, we know that that number is still too high, but it is trending in the right direction, and the government is getting on with even more practical measures to be able to lower it even further. And I'm pleased to report that as Minister for Women, I will be delivering for the very first time ever in the history of the parliament a women's economic security statement focused on these practical measures. But of course the government is making great strides when it comes to women's economic security and their retirement income, because of course we have lifted the restrictions preventing women from making personal deductible contributions to their superannuation, no matter who employs them or how they are employed. We are also helping those women who have taken time out of the workforce to be able to catch up on their superannuation contributions, a catch-up contribution on a rolling 5-year basis. Now, the member for Bennelong, he asks, are there any risks, any suggestions, any plans that might threaten this? Well, yes, there are, and it is the Leader of the Opposition and the Labor Party. They would scrap these catch-up contributions because they have a plan to harm the retirement savings of Australian women. They would no longer see a levelling of the playing field and would not allow the personal deductions that I spoke of. And worse still, Labor would impose a mega retiree tax that would disproportionately impact Australian women. So why on earth does Labor have this plan against financial security for Australia?
The member for McMahon has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Gross debt is at a record $500 billion under this government. So why is the Treasurer giving away at least $11 million in public debt interest in the first year alone as a result of the government transferring almost $500 million in taxpayers' money to a small private foundation in a closed-door meeting with the Prime Minister?
The Treasurer has the
Thank you,
call.
Mr Speaker. I could ask of the Shadow Treasurer, why did their government give money to dead people and pets and all of these things, Mr Speaker? But he has asked the question. I want to know also, what has the Labor Party got against Nemo, Mr Speaker? This is a government that has invested $500 million in saving the reef. And I tell you, the minister brought forward a proposal to save the reef, and not just to save the reef, but to work in partnership with others outside of this building, outside of government, to save the reef, Mr Speaker. Now, maybe the Labor Party thinks the Australian people are like Dory, Mr Speaker. They just forget everything. They forget that there was the Shadow Treasurer, when he was the Minister for Immigration, racked up $11.5 billion and more in additional deficits because he couldn't control the borders, Mr Speaker. Or they'll forget Grocery Watch and Fuel Watch, or they'll forget cash for clunkers, or they'll forget the economic record of the member for Lilly. But they won't, Mr Speaker. They won't. What we have done on the Great Barrier Reef is creating jobs in the reef up there. The member for Leichhardt knows all about that. The member for Capricornia knows all that. The member for Herbert is hiding under the desk when we talk about the Great Barrier Reef, Mr Speaker, because they know that this government has gone out there and invested in the future of the reef. and we think it's the right thing to do that in partnership with others out there in the community who are working to do the same thing. The Labor Party think all the answers reside only sitting around public service desks, sitting in government buildings, Mr Speaker. Maybe that's why the member for Rankin wants to put up taxes so he can have more and more and more public servants. His great idea, the member for Rankin, is to increase efficiency by abolishing the efficiency dividend, Mr Speaker. That's the genius of the member for Rankin. The genius of the member for Rankin. And we know, Mr Speaker, that they want to increase taxes for one simple reason. They want more desks in Canberra, not more desks in schools, Mr Speaker. They want a bigger public service. It'll go back to the ballooning public service we've seen in Victoria, we've seen in Queensland, Mr Speaker. They cannot control their spending. This is a government that has invested $500 million. And what the Shadow Treasurer wants to deny them is the extra $11 million that comes from them being able to invest that money into more success on the reef, Mr Speaker. So this government makes no apologies for, one, investing in the reef, and two, doing it in partnership. That was the proposal, that was the deal, that's what we put in the budget, that's what the member for Sydney welcomed on the night, but maybe she has a memory like Dory as well.
The member for Forest has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the minister update the House on action the government is taking to support more than 700,000 Australian women currently living with the debilitating condition of endometriosis?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And I want to thank the member for Forest, who, along with the member for Canberra, the member for Boothby and many others, has been a powerful advocate for action on endometriosis. She brought to this parliament the story of her daughter, Kylie, and how Kylie's condition destroyed so much of her life, and how, as a consequence, she became a passionate advocate. But I acknowledge, as I have earlier, the member for Canberra and the member for Boothby and many others, this is an example of this parliament working at its very best. And through their collective work, plus many others, the result was that a Parliamentary Friends of Endometriosis was created. At that meeting, the government gave a long overdue national apology for the silence that had confronted so many women and which they themselves had been forced to adopt in relation to this condition. It's a menstrual condition. It can have a debilitating impact not just on Kylie, but we know about 700,000 women, if not more, because of underdiagnosis, I say that, whose lives can be deeply affected and they can lose fertility, they can suffer with chronic pain, and of course, as a consequence of that, they can also be exposed to mental health conditions. And so, as a result of that joint Parliamentary Friends group, which has people of all sides involved, the government agreed to put forward and to develop with the community and the sector a national action plan for endometriosis. People from all sides of Parliament, the community, the women's movement, the medical profession came together to develop it. And there were really four key elements there. One was in relation to education for women and girls, to acknowledge and to identify the signs and to seek help, but also for the medical profession, where there had been too little information, as many have acknowledged, for too long. Secondly, better approaches to diagnosis. Thirdly, better approaches to treatment. And fourthly, the search for a cure through research. And in response to that plan, the government has committed about $4.7 million to treatment of endometriosis and to pursuing those four goals. And that includes $2.5 million for clinical trials, for seeking new treatments and working with women who are afflicted with endometriosis. So this is a really profound and important step forward. It's accompanied by the funding for GPs of $1 million to work with the medical profession to assist them in better understanding and earlier diagnosis. So all of these things come together. It's been a tough week in some ways, in the sense that the parliament has been at its most conflictual. But when we look at this topic, we see the parliament working, we see the democracy working, and we see outcomes for women around Australia.
The member for Ballarat on indulgence.
Thank you, Speaker, and I seek to associate the opposition with the remarks of the minister. I do think it is an example of the parliament at its best when you have the parliamentary friends being established to highlight such an important disease for women, and I do, as the government has said and as the opposition has said on many occasions, particularly member for Canberra, member for Boothby, we commend the government for its actions on recognising endometriosis and certainly want to continue that fight ourselves as well.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm that even under its own figures for private fundraising, it took the Great Barrier Reef Foundation more than 18 years to raise $58 million and just 18 minutes with the Prime Minister to get almost $500 million?
The Prime Minister.
Well, Mr. Speaker, this question's been asked so many times, and it's been answered. It's been answered by the minister again and again. I just remind the honourable member, a submission was brought by the Minister for the Environment in the normal way through the cabinet process. The Great Barrier Reef Foundation, as the honourable member knows very well, is extremely well known to the Department of Environment, having dealt with it for many years, and particularly in the administration of a grant made to the foundation at the time the honourable member was minister. So the grant was made pursuant to a cabinet process. It's been fully documented, the due diligence process the minister has described. But the important thing is it is going to protect the Great Barrier Reef. And this is the point that the honourable member fails to pay due regard to. The Great Barrier Reef, under the Labor government, got to the point of being on the edge, as it were, of falling onto the endangered list of UNESCO. There was a very, very considerable effort had to be undertaken in order to persuade UNESCO that the policies and programs being applied to the reef, both currently and prospectively, were going to maintain its health. This is part of that commitment. The money is going to a foundation very well known to the department and indeed to the minister, and it will be administered over 6 years to protect the Great Barrier Reef, and you would think that that is an outcome that honourable members opposite would be supporting.
The member for Fadden.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer update the House on any recently initiated actions regarding cartel conduct in the construction industry?
Treasurer has the call.
Please do.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. I can advise the House that the ACCC has advised that criminal charges have been laid against the Construction, Forestry, Maritime, Mining and Energy Union and its ACT Divisional Branch Secretary, Jason O'Mara, in relation to alleged cartel conduct. The statement says that CFMEU and Mr O'Mara are each charged with attempting to induce suppliers of steel fixing services and scaffolding services to reach cartel contracts, arrangements or understandings containing cartel provisions in relation to services provided to builders in the ACT in 2012 and 2013. The charges follow a joint investigation between the ACCC and the Australian Federal Police as part of the AFP's role in coordinating and contributing to the Joint Police Task Force following the Royal Commission into Trade Union Governance and Corruption, which those opposite will be very familiar with. The charges have been prosecuted by the Commonwealth Department of Director of Public Prosecutions, and Mr. Speaker, the first mention of these charges before the ACT Magistrates Court is scheduled for 27th of September 2018, Mr. Speaker. And I am reading from the ACCC's media statement. I'd be happy to table it for you in a written form. You may want to read it. You may want to be advised of it, because what does it take for the Labor Party to stop taking money from the CFMEU, Mr. Speaker? Some $2.4 million in donations have been funnelled to the Labor Party under this Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Speaker, and some $11 million or thereabouts over their period of time, Mr. Speaker. What does it take for the Labor Party to say to the CFMEU, no more money for us? We're over your criminal and corrupt and thuggish and bullish conduct, Mr Speaker. They've got to stop giving awards to these thugs, and they should be supporting the government in ensuring they're prosecuted by the courts. This is a Labor opposition and a Labor leader who is so weak-kneed when it comes to the union movement. He makes Ben Andrews look like a corruption fighter, Mr Speaker.
The member for Grayndler on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker. The Treasurer in his answer began by outlining in great detail that a matter was before the courts. He has then proceeded to prejudice matters that are before the courts with his comments.
Treasurer resume his seat. I want to rule on the point of order. If members could cease interjecting, particularly the member for Barton, I could actually address the point. I've got to say, as I was listening to the answer, I was becoming concerned. The practice writes up the approach to sub judice, and there's a scale of things depending on whether something's before the court, whether there's a jury, and at what stage it's at. I'm not aware of obviously all of the details of every case and what stages they're at, but certainly when it comes to criminal matters, the practice makes it very clear that those matters are more high risk, and I've just cautioned the Treasurer because there's a long history of on the sub judice rule on these matters.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I agree, obviously, with your ruling, because the Labor Party seems to think that this is the only matter the CFMEU have ever been involved with, Mr Speaker. My comments in relation to the broader activities and the other activities of the CFMEU, Mr Speaker, should have been reason enough for the Labor Party to turn its back on that thuggish bunch of crooks, Mr Speaker, that occupy the CFMEU. But instead of doing that, what this mob over here do, Mr Speaker, is they move their wheelbarrow into the money.
The Manager of Opposition Business. I'm going to hear the Manager of Opposition Business.
Speaker, in relation to the earlier point of order, if the Treasurer hadn't crossed the line at that point, I would suggest that he well and truly has now.
Members will cease interjecting.
You're a serious dickhead.
No, the member for Grayndler's made his point of order. The Manager of Opposition Business is now making his. Okay, I don't need stereo on the subject.
If the principle of the words of practice is meant to be that we don't prejudice cases, to begin by referring to someone having been charged and to then start invoking words like crooks, it's a bit hard to see how you're doing anything, or how the Treasurer is doing anything other than trying to prejudice a case.
I think we'll just move to the next question. I think that would be the most prudent thing to do. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you. My question is to the Prime Minister. It is now a matter of record that the Prime Minister offered the Brisbane-based private Great Barrier Reef Foundation almost $500 million of taxpayers' money in a closed-door meeting on April the 9th. Prime Minister, why weren't the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, the Australian Institute of Marine Sciences or the CSIRO even invited to tender for the $500 million contract of taxpayer money?
The Minister for the Environment and Energy.
Serious.
The Leader of the Opposition
It's
is
unparliamentary.
catcalling across the dispatch boxes is not going to occur.
Mr Speaker, it's an inconvenient truth for the Leader of the Opposition that the coalition government is saving the reef when Labor abandoned it, Mr Speaker. That's the inconvenient truth for the Labor Party. Because we've heard from the Prime Minister that when the Labor Party was last in office, they put the Great Barrier Reef on a fast track to the endanger list, Mr Speaker, on a fast track to the endanger list. They failed to put in place a long-term plan to secure jobs in the member for Capricornia's seat, in the member for Dawson's seat, in the member for Herbert's seat, in the member for Leichhardt's seat, Mr Speaker. They failed to put in place a long-term plan. They had 5 capital dredge disposal projects planned for the marine park, Mr Speaker. That's what they had. They failed to allocate funding. In fact, funding was about half of what it is under the Turnbull government today, Mr Speaker. We have put in place a long-term Reef 2050 plan in partnership with the Queensland Government, $2 billion. We've committed this $500 million. And do you know who is on the board of the Great Barrier Reef Foundation, Mr Speaker? The chairman of the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, Mr Speaker.
The Minister for the Environment and Energy will resume his seat. The Manager of Opposition business on a point of order.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. The question itself went entirely to who was invited to tender for the contract. Entirely to that, and I'd simply put it to you that this is not directly relevant in any way.
I'll call the minister back. He does need to be relevant to the question, and I'll call the minister back.
Mr Speaker, the best partner for the Commonwealth Government was the Foundation because of its proven track record and its ability to leverage off the philanthropic sector. The fact of the matter is the Foundation works closely with the CSIRO, with AIMS, with the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park Authority, so much so that when Labor was in office, Labor decided to provide money to the Foundation. Again, Labor abandoned the reef and the coalition is saving it.
The member for Menzies.
Mr Speaker, I asked the Minister for Home Affairs if he would update the House on the importance of strong border protection measures for Australia, and secondly, is he aware of any alternative plans that would weaken Australia's borders?
The Minister for Immigration and Home Affairs.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for his question. It is the case, Mr Speaker, that this government has worked day and night to keep our borders secure. We have sought to clean up Labor's mess, and we really regret the fact, Mr Speaker, that Labor is still proposing a policy which would allow the boats to recommence, allow the deaths at sea, sadly, to recommence, and allow the detention centres, we've closed 17 of them, to reopen. Now, Mr Speaker, I want to mention a name that my colleagues won't be familiar with. It's the member for Blair. Now, you may not have heard of him. You've certainly not heard from him, but he has been the shadow immigration minister now for 750 days. He's been, Mr Speaker,
Members
the shadow minister.
Right. The Minister for Agriculture.
He's been the shadow minister for immigration for 120 question times. Now, Mr Speaker, he's not asked one question on boats. Not asked one question. So,
Put your hand up.
Nonetheless, Mr Speaker, I've got a bit of a soft spot for the member for Blair. And, you know, Mr Speaker, I've got to say, I've just been advised that after all of this period of time, the member for Blair has asked for his first briefing from my department on Operation Sovereign Borders. I feel almost, Mr Speaker, like a proud father. You know when your child takes a first step or a milestone? He's not yet speaking. He's a little slow at speaking, but he has taken one baby step. And, Mr Speaker, it might be a little... It's a little too... it's too little too late, I fear, Mr Speaker, because he's out there, he's already announced the policy, not having been properly briefed. He's provided advice about how they'll change the policy, how they'll water down our policy, how they'll allow the boats to get back into business. And now he asks for a briefing on how we've stopped the boats. Wouldn't it have been a better move to ask for the briefing first, Mr Speaker? Wouldn't it have been better to ask the government, how did you clean up Labor's mess? We arrived 50,000 people on 800 boats when we were in government, he would say. How did you stop them? I mean, how did the Liberal government stop the boats? How did we get kids out of detention? How did we close 17 detention centres that Labor opened? Why is it that I've not had a death at sea on my watch, and yet under Labor 1,200 people tragically drowned? I mean, would these have been logical questions for the Shadow Minister for Immigration to ask? Mr Speaker, you can only imagine what the first 750 days of a Labor government would bring. You can imagine what the first 750 hours would bring. Boats, boats, boats.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed in the notice.
Thank the Prime Minister.